I'm Yvonne Caput, and I'm coming at this sort of research to practice webinar on board planning from two perspectives. So as a faculty member and a researcher who studies board governance and leadership, and then also as a founder of a software application named Board Checkup that has helped that's a best practice application to help boards fulfill their governance responsibilities and improve their effectiveness. So sort of wearing two hats here. And that's why this series is called Board Research to Practice. And it really uses the board checkup methodology, which is to surface issues, to talk about them, understand why they exist and what you can do about them. And hang on a minute, I'm trying to move my, oops, sorry guys, I lost the presentation, just a minute. Are you seeing this full screen?
Yeah, I saw.
Okay, here we go. So the sort of agenda is that framework, talking about the board's role in planning. What issues challenge boards within the planning function, talking about why these challenges exist, and what have boards done about them. So I'm going to draw evidence from the research, from a review of the literature, and then some common best practices related to this topic. And maybe before we start, I know maybe just because there's just the three of us here, maybe just introduce yourself and what interested you in this topic. So maybe we'll start with Caesar.
I am a member of board of directors of Christian University at Colombia, at Medellin, Colombia. And I'm interested because we are planning, in a hard environment.
Yeah.
And I would like to know more about the planning, the role of the board in the planning of the institution.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, we're going to cover this today. Okay, John.
And hi, Caesar. Is that how you pronounce it, Caesar?
Cesar.
Okay,
Cesar.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John.
Yeah, I'm an educator with Michigan State University Extension. I've been to several of Dr. Kafik's presentations at conferences, in particular, one that's held every couple of years in normal health times in Kansas City, and have used the board checkup with one board. Unfortunately, that was at about the same time as the fee structure changed, and they weren't able, in the midst of the whole COVID thing, to decide to hang on and do some follow-up. I did some work with them using the results of their use of board checkup as kind of a pretest for the educational piece I did with them. We spread that out over the course of about a year. Their board was meeting on Zoom, so I was joining them for the first 20 minutes or so of each of their board meetings. And they really appreciated the format. They really appreciated the ability to focus on one topic at a time and connect that back to their the evaluation that they had done of their own board. So just interested in learning more and continuing to make that more effective for the year and a half or so I have left before I retire.
Okay, great. Well, just to let you know, we do have with the subscription, if a board has financial difficulty, there's a waiver of the fee. So,
They have a new executive director, and I'll mention that to her when I talk with her here in the not too distant future.
yeah, so if there is some financial hardship and it's a decision, to do this or this, that I think that constitutes that you can't do it because of for a resource constraint, there's that option there.
Okay.
Then some boards have used it. So just to know that. Okay, wonderful. Well, I think I'm glad that you're coming in. John's coming in from an educational perspective. We're certainly going to touch on the value of education. So this is a review of what we talked about in last month's webinar, one of the sort of overview of what the board's responsibilities are within the governance function. And today we sort of briefly covered all of them, but today we're going to zero in on the top line, which is mission, values, vision, goal, and priorities. So around the board's responsibility in this area. So I wanted to, maybe just quickly pause here to say, do you think that in your experience, and I know Cesar, you mentioned, what are the challenges? So in your experience, either going into it or having been part of a planning process, did any issues surface for you? And maybe just top of mind, just throw them out.
Well, I think that we used to be a seminar.
Okay.
People came to the seminar and was a presential education. And now we are going to virtual education. So part of that's nice for one side, but also there is problems because less people go presential. So in some way, we have problems with the planning of the infrastructure, money, and things like that. And
Okay.
we are developing the virtual part too. We are doing pretty well, but anyway, there is discussion about what is better for a people who is going to become pastor, is going to or develop evangelical education and things like that. And most of the financial are from sources, not for the cost of tuition and things like that. But we get donation. So it's hard to plan to develop a thing. And I was curious about how are doing in the companies, in the
Nonprofit.
Yes.
Okay. So, and John, in all your experience, what do you think the issues are in your work with boards?
The one I hear the most is we've just got so many issues that are on our plate right now that we have to make decisions on, that it's hard sometimes to just set all the other stuff aside and really do some forward thinking planning.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, great. Well, so, these are in the board checkup. These are the items that pertain to planning, the board's role in planning. And so these are the issues that board members either agree or disagree exist in their board. So having not enough time to establish a clear mission and vision, not having enough time to explore changes in the external environment and opportunities, not learning about the concerns of stakeholders externally who could influence the organization, not doing a good job about learning about the concerns of communities that have a stake in the organization, holding creative thinking sessions, learning about innovations and how they might be useful. There isn't a clear, well-developed plan that lays out the goals and priorities for the organization, or there may be a plan, but it doesn't get operationalized or implemented. So these are the issues that board members would have reflected on in the checkup. And these are the results of those items. So you can see here where I've got the red, these are the top challenges facing those or perspectives of those of 7,000 board members who have assessed performance of their board. And you can see that these 4 fall into the agree that they exist to some extent in their boards. And so, or they somewhat disagree, but not strongly. So in what that looks like, sort of summarized, is I put board checkup highlights using a dashboard of red, yellow, green. And so here, and it also surfaces top challenges and the strengths. So I put in red here what the most salient issue, and that would be rarely holding those thinking sessions and finding new ways the organization can develop. And then in sort of orange are these other ones, not having enough time, again, to explore opportunities and challenges, not doing a good job of learning about what external stakeholders' concerns are, and learning about the concerns of the communities that the organization serves. So those are sort of the more salient issue from the perspective of board members. Now, why do these issues surface, right? And why do they exist? And I think, Cesar, you mentioned this when you first came on and we were talking, that the environment is so turbulent. There's so much change going on. We're coming out of COVID-19. It's really hard to understand the issues that are facing the organization. It makes it really tough to plan in this kind of environment. And so, that's a very valid and reasonable explanation. But there's also, and I think this was reflected in our earlier conversation about what is the board's role in planning vis-a-vis management, and having sort of, does the board and management, quite frankly, have the leadership competency to be effective within this function, which clearly lies within the governance function. And then, is there enough development of leaders, both management and board, in this planning role? So I love hearing, John, that you're still involved in education, because we're going to get to that in a minute. And also, another explanation is that, again, going back to what John was saying, there's just simply not enough time to examine sort of big picture questions. And, the focus is in this environment on the day-to-day and putting out fires, right? And so this doesn't, the big picture thinking doesn't happen. And, or it could be that the structures within that board don't allow this to occur. And that could happen, for example, on how meetings are structured and facilitated, the type of agenda, and David Wren's one of the, key scholars in the field of nonprofit governance, talks a lot about this, and the practical value of consent agendas to move routine matters off the agenda, and allowing more time for for thinking and discussing the issues. And so that's a real practical tool that could allow for that. But also, how are committees structured? How does the board organize itself for this to occur? And who's providing oversight of whether the board is actually meeting its responsibilities for planning? Is that assigned, for example, to the governance committee? And or is there a task group that's been assigned to provide leadership around this process, so it doesn't bog the entire board down and derail all the other work that it needs to do? So these are just some of the explanations for why boards experience difficulties. And so, you know, what is it, the natural, okay, well, what can we do to increase effectiveness? And, you know, this is not a simple, there's not a simple answer to this question. So it's got multiple parts to it that I'm going to cover. So the first part in addressing this and increasing effectiveness is getting clear on the concept. What's strategic governance? What's planning? And what does an effective planning process look like? And so here's where I'm going to go, and I'm going to draw from the literature on this first treatment, and then talk about the board's role in planning. And there is no one best role for the board. It has to be decided within, you know, the characteristics of the organization. But, you know, there are some boundaries, right? And there's some guidance here on what that could look like. And then ensuring there are enough resources. So, you know, Cesar, you talked about donations and, you know, how do you fund and resource this kind of process, and having enough resources not to facilitate it, to access reliable data, and to manage the process to avoid the pitfalls. This is really important as well. And your process can fail because it simply didn't have enough resources behind it. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a framework that has helped. And I know from the boards that have used Board Checkup, this comes up a lot. This framework has really helped them. And I've actually been on boards recently and been testing it out myself. And I know that it works quite well, and provides a really rational way for people to grasp what this looks like. What does planning sort of look like, big picture? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So getting clear on the concepts. First one, you know, what's strategic and what's strategic planning? And so, you know, I'm drawing here from Chait, Ryan, and Taylor on the strategic, on, you know, sort of the bigger picture questions, and you know, that you address in a planning process around who are we serving, but who should we be serving? You know, yes, here are the services we provide. What services should we be providing? How should we provide them? And what resources must we have in order to provide them? And so it's sort of alignment of with your financial resources, with your strategy here, sort of a, you know, we'll talk about resource development in another session, but it's about strategic budgeting as well. And what is planning? It's really just the process around establishing the mission, vision, and values and priorities that provide that guidance, that framework for the organizations, where the organization is going and what that looks like, and its success measures. Now, Chait, Ryan, and Taylor lay out on the planning process more and less effective approaches to planning. And this is vis-a-vis management. And less effective approaches tend to look like what's on the left-hand side, where this is done in isolation outside of the board. Management prepares the plan, it presents it to the board, and it lays out the resources that it needs. It's usually just an extension of what's already happening, and changes very much incremental. And the board then approves that plan and sort of may talk about have questions around this, but simply more of a rubber stamp to that. And then the board's role as a fiduciary is to monitor that, and in its strategic governance role would just monitor whether that plan has been achieved or not. Now, what Chait, Ryan, and Taylor say is the more effective approach is really around working collaboratively. And this is where their concept of governance as leadership comes into play. The other one is leadership as governance, and where the plan is generated with the board. So there's a lot of collaboration. It does focus on the big, hairy, audacious goals, the bigger picture questions. The board's thinking strategically and advising the CEO, and directors do provide valuable input into that process. They are a source of insight. They do come from different communities. They are supposed to give voice to those as part of their duties, their legal duties. And they work really together to provide consensus about strategy. And this sort of work builds in what Chait, Ryan, and Taylor called generative governance, where strategy emerges from this kind of collaborative process. And within that, the board really does need to specify the data that it needs. It needs to make sense of this. So it's very much engaged, the board, in the planning process. And the board then can change itself to organize itself around those priorities. And I'll give you an example of that, where in a board that, a couple of boards that I've been linked up with and served on, and still serve on some of them, where we restructured our committees around those key goal areas, so that more of this kind of work could be done in committee to find out, and very focused on what's happening, and still working collaboratively with management around that. Because again, you're planning for the future using the best data that you have now. That, stuff happens along the way, and it's rarely a linear process. So the board can organize itself around these priorities, and then it create those structures where those plans can be monitored, and maybe the operationalization of some of them, especially farther out goals, can be thought through, and utilizing the strengths in that board. So these are just sort of the planning process, what an effective one looks like, you would observe, and a less effective. So then the key question really is, so you sort of understand that, what is the role of our board in planning? What is the board's role in planning that you would ask any board would ask itself if it's considering reviewing this question? And roles then here stem from leadership of both the board and staff, right? And I talked about this shift from governance as leadership to and then the opposite as leadership as governance. Those are those two styles. And so you know, the leadership role, and I think, Cesar, you were talking about being clear about this, right? Between the board's leadership role in the planning process and management, and having a conversation about that. Again, the more effective approach would be to collaborate, but to be clear on who's doing what in this, and getting clear on that process with making sure that all those elements occur. And then how are decisions made? Like, who owns this? And then getting clear about the board's role as sort of the owner of the plan, making decisions about it, and the board as a whole, not the individual committees that will make recommendations. And then management having to operationalize this and implement it. And, you know, you can fail because these aren't very well set out, or they're unrealistic. The plan is so future oriented, it can't be operationalized. And so there's a lot happens within this framework. So the third treatment area I mentioned earlier was about ensuring there are enough resources for an effective process, and making sure that that's managed. Like, who's going to do that? And so some of the dilemmas then that emerge are, you know, who's on your board? What's the composition of your board? And, you know, not most boards lack this. They lack even basic governance expertise, never mind experience and competency in planning. It's a lot to put on a board member. And so does the board even know what its leadership strengths and gaps are? And has that assessment been done? And so that's important to consider, like, who's on your team, right? Who's on your team? Who do you need to recruit? And this is where actually I think governance starts to get more functional, where you do then look at your board, not just as decision makers, but board members playing functional roles based on who they are and what they bring to it. And the research around inclusion shows it's through functional inclusion, when you align someone with their leadership competencies to a task or a role, where they become really effective and the board becomes more effective as a whole. And so it's giving thought that not everybody is the same. Yes, everybody has the same voice. They get one vote, but not everybody is the same. There's diversity here. And I'm talking about knowledge and leadership competency in this context. And then the other part about what can undermine planning is, where's this data coming from? You know, when it could, you know, management, where is management getting its data? What is there independently generated data? Or is it, you know, that has to be, where is it coming from? And how is it data being used to inform the planning process? And this is where the boards really needs to ask those questions and specify the data that it thinks it needs or should be researched to come back. And then you'll know whether you've got a robust, whether your decisions, you know, really have been informed decisions, because that is one of the legal roles. We talked about this last month, which is about the duty to be informed, right? And doing your due diligence on that. So when you do make a decision, it's both informed and in the best interest of the corporation. And then the other dilemmas around the plan, going back to that less effective approach, is it really strategic? You know, I was in a board meeting actually this week where where we are about to vote. We haven't yet, but we're very close to voting on a strategic plan. And it had been identified that the next step was to operationalize or to review what operationalization of that plan would look like, and that would come back to the board next. But then in the management report, it seemed to me that a lot of the stuff that was in it was already being done. And so it wasn't needing to be operationalized at all. And so I asked, well, when you send this out, could you highlight what already has been operationalized, has been implemented, and what hasn't? So, you know, that's just a sneaky way, I think, of maintaining the status quo. But anyways, it's something that was a good question, and it was pretty obvious that things were already happening and some things weren't new. But we never would have had a conversation like that if we weren't engaged in this collaborative form of development. And so that was, you know, well received, and the ED said she would do that when she sent it out. So making sure there are enough resources all around, like on the board, who's on your team, who do you need, and same with management. And then whatever gaps you have, you can fill them. Education is certainly one of them. That's why, John, I was happy that you're here. So this is a big opportunity for board development. And, you know, that can take place before planning, in a retreat. You can build those kinds of things in. And really, especially if you're going to be shifting roles from being a rubber stamp to collaborating. Now, at my university that I was at, one of the universities, I was asked to facilitate the board checkup with the board of the university. And so I did. And I worked with the board to facilitate the results that were generated by it. And we organized the committees, existing committees took on different questions that were issues. And one of them came up around planning. There was an issue about planning, and that it was around the board having been a rubber stamp for the plans that the college had brought to the board. And so anyways, there was a really good discussion in the meeting that we had to results, lots of insights generated, and that was all I had at that point. Then I was on the other side the next, so that happened in the fall. A year later, the board on the faculty side, sitting around the faculty table, the board chair came to meet with the faculty to say that it had redefined its role in planning in the university. And it wanted to talk about how planning would happen and get the faculty's feedback. Well, I was sitting there going, wow, I can see how this had resulted in a real change in behavior of that board, and how it saw its role, its leadership, and how planning was going to unfold. And then I listened to my colleagues who were just baffled by this change. How did this happen? This has never happened before. And, you know, all kinds of questions. So on both sides, there's a lot of work that has to be done if you're going to shift from one style of leadership to another in the governance function around this. So, so some of the challenges then around managing the process. So, you know, it's not going to be linear just because you've got the stacked team. You think it's got all the leadership competency you need. You've educated your board, you've resourced this properly. You can still get into trouble, and challenges can emerge at every step of the way. So you know, so part of it could be a lack of planning. So even if, let's say, there's just a lack of planning per se, can result in mission drift. You're just sort of going anywhere. And I've been on boards where I've seen that happen. Of course, we read about this as being a big problem, but it does happen more often than we think. And so, you know, what are some of the opportunities around that is to really ask those inquiry questions. And the board checkup helps you to start those conversations. And the way I think its value in this regard is that it's designed to be safe. You know, these are not easy things to bring up, but it's structured in a way where no one knows who said what. Everyone completes it. So there's some common, there's some validity around that, especially if you've got all the opinions on the board of where people stand on these issues. And that's really helpful. But it does provide a framework for you to have these conversations. Just like I had this week about what's been operationalized and what hasn't. That question wasn't taken, was taken really positively, but that may not be the case, right? If you've never had created an environment that's safe like that, where people can give voice who are really interested in the best interests of the organization. So asking you, these are opportunities for generative thinking, having those inquiry questions. I'm going to show you, I think I kept this in, what inquiry questions are. I had it last month, and you really can have a set of standard questions if people don't know. Bloom's taxonomy is a great one where you can dial to the type. If it's a lack of knowledge, you can ask knowledge-based questions. If it's a lack of analysis, you can ask those kinds of questions. If it's an evaluation, there are evaluation questions. The other one around values. So not having any values articulated. There's a whole shift now in principles-based evaluation that are based on values that can make your strategies evaluable, like articulated in a way where they provide clear direction and you can measure them. And so that's a whole approach in itself called principles-based evaluation. It's based on values. And I've been involved. I went to a workshop about 3 or 4 years ago on it. And now I facilitated it with one of my academic programs with the community. And it really is a wonderful framework because it provides clarity for everybody on what it is you value and what the boundaries are around it. So I really like it. The other one about the vision, is it unrealistic or is it same old, same old? You know, really needing this scan of the environment, you know, what's going on to be able to envision in a sort of predictive way. And what's realistic? What evidence do you need? You know, and so you need to, that needs to be informed. The scan, so again, not enough data. And then do you have data do you have access to it? So I think rethinking your information systems, again, not only to inform planning, but once you have that, do you have the data and the systems in place to get reports on these things systematically? And so again, aligning up the information systems around it so you can see where you're at. The goal setting. So a challenge is, and I see this a lot in these planning process, what the priorities are. And you can't do everything at once. And you have a turbulent environment. Maybe you can only set certain ones now, right? And be clear about those. And so that really is an area where I think it can be exhausting and people run out of steam, I think, when they get to that part. But again, those priorities are really important. And you can categorize those and then divvy them up. Who's responsible for what? Again, you know, if you align your structures with these things, you can keep tabs on them and move some of the work out of the board, but get reports on them. On the implementation, are they linked to this, to the operational plans? And how's that happening? And, you know, that's a really, that needs to be teased out, and CEOs really, that's where they can go back to staff and figure that out and have a robust discussion. And I always say, you know, when boards start really governing, then EDs are going to have to start really managing. And they're not going to be governing anymore, which, you know, they've creeped into this role. They're going to have to start managing, and it's going to be strategic. And there's a lot of tools and resources out there on the management side. And I think this is where management has to say, hey, we need a lot of development here. It's not going to happen overnight. This also needs to be resourced properly. And then accountability. You know, what's a plan without, you know, understanding where you are and monitoring that and using the data generated from it to, you know, course correct or identify factors that, you know, that are having an impact on it that you can talk about, like, you know, COVID-19. You know, you may have had the best plan in the world in January of 2020, but in March, it went out the window. And I'll give you an example of this. I was part of a program where I was moving everything online. And a lot of the stakeholders, they didn't want that. They wanted face-to-face. There was a lot of resistance, a ton of resistance to it. And COVID-19 happened. There's never been, and there was not face-to-face for years, right? For those 2 years. And it's so silly not to plan for the future, right? Because that's what planning is, and not being clear about that and the impact. Luckily, I didn't listen to them and put everything online. And we operated without a hitch. Like we just kept our classes. We didn't have to train our faculty. They're already trained. We already had and we chose platforms that were highly engaging, that were where you could facilitate, you know, teams and collaboration, and all of those things those decisions were. So, you know, so again, luckily we had planned well for that. And that resistance didn't derail it. There's so many examples of resistance to big, hairy, audacious goals. Like, do you remember the company called Blockbuster? They don't exist anymore because a company called Netflix came along and they didn't believe in that model. And Netflix knew what the future was going to be, and it went all in. And Blockbuster didn't. It actively resisted that change, and they don't exist anymore. But their board members pushed on that. If you read that case study, you will get resistance to things that are very innovative. And how are you going to manage that? Right? That's a tough one. I don't have an answer to that yet. Okay. Oh yeah, here are the questions. So this is just an example of what Ryan Taylor talk about, you know, kind of questions that lead to strategic governance or in fiduciary governance from an inquiry perspective, rather than this sort of yes or no dichotomous stale questions, you know, like, do we have enough money? Yes or no? Do we have enough money for that? To what is the implications of our investment in that on our other existing programs, right? We're going to make some strategic investments here. How do we know whether this is this X connects to this outcome that we have that's so important to us? How does it connect? Can you explain that to me? What criteria are you using to suggest that course of action? What would predict this outcome? Or what changes do you think would happen if you did that? If we implemented this, what do you expect to see? And how are we going to manage that? Or how are we going to collect data on that to monitor it? So these are just some of the questions that lead to, you know, strategic thinking or conversations, generative governance types of engagement at the board level. The last question then I talked about was this framework, and we get this a lot, boards using this framework to help them to have the conversation around planning, to think about, well, what are sort of the, when you're thinking about planning, rather than getting into it, what is a planning framework? What are some of the questions a board should address in planning, in a planning process? And so this comes out of a book Vic Murray and I wrote in 2014, and it's available. You can download it for free. I have it here. It's just a short book. And in the planning section, it has this as a treatment and basically provides an overview. So the board at the beginning could understand what questions really it needs to address in a plan. And they don't all have to be addressed in the order here in which that's listed. For example, I've used this framework myself with several boards. I took several boards through that I was on with this in the last few years. And we started with change and our SWOT, and we then use that to talk about the mission and vision and values, and then we led to goals and priorities, and then operationalize them, and then restructuring the board around them. And now actually in one of them, we're on the last one, because we didn't have access to data that we needed to be able to monitor this and to report to our funders. So a lot of the strategy was funded by government, and we must report on it with the best data that we have. And so now we're reviewing our systems and tools, like online tools, where you know, we're sort of a dispersed organization where that data can be entered and reports generated. They give us some idea of where we are. So that this framework really is, it's been reported by boards who use the checkup and used. I've been involved with it. On the research side, so what do boards change after they come back at a second point in time? So John, you know, your board that you worked with, did they only do it once?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you came back, so the data from this, for this question, comes from boards who came back and assessed their performance again, but before they did, they had to complete our impact assessment. And it asked questions about, well, what happened? What changed? Was there any change made at all, if any? And then the coordinator inputs it in the dimensions assessed using their own words. But the, in the area of planning, the changes over and over and over again around strategic. In fact, I'm going to show you a word cloud, and only two words came out of the hundreds of boards that responded, and that the board was more strategic and engaged. And it was more assertive in that example I gave you in its planning role. It became clear about its role in planning. Now, in terms of changes that, of changes. So overall, of all the changes that boards make when they assess their performance, 43% of those who came back reported specific changes in planning, in the board's planning role. Other changes that are related to it, like board composition, for example, they're not just, they're related to other areas, like who do we need to have on this board? Do we have the leadership competency? And so on. So some questions for you to consider, and, given all the, failures of planning, and, Henry Mintzberg, a Canadian scholar out of McGill, who's quite cynical about planning. He's written many, many books about it, has no faith in planning, quite frankly. And he thinks it sort of fails to influence anything. Just talking amongst ourselves, why do you think that is? Is there anything we didn't cover, perhaps?
No, it's pretty complete. Let me ask you something. Can we have the PowerPoint?
Oh, yeah, I'll provide it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, John, what do you think?
I think there are both many reasons why that are, how to categorize them. Strategic, maybe there it's a failure to implement because of, let me go back to the first one. One is just simply the lack of will. We get all done with the plan. We still like the status quo. Whatever the reasons are, we just go, yeah, okay, we've got a plan now. We did our planning, but we're not going to do anything with it. We just don't have a will to change. The other category that pops into my head is more about 1,000 other reasons. We all agreed on X, Y, and Z as things that we had to get done, and we just didn't have the money to do it. Or we didn't have the staff resources. We didn't have the staff expertise. 1,000 different reasons why we wanted to, but we just weren't able to carry through on it.
Yeah. Do you think, go ahead, Cesar.
Oh. Now, about 8 years ago, we have a very serious situation in the institution. And we work with the book that you mentioned there. And we made several changes. In the last 8 years, we do very well. But now, after the pandemic thing, we get problems again.
Okay.
And several of the members of the board retired, and we have to put new people. Then we have to try to, to capacitate the people, the new people. And we are in that point. But also there were changes in the government politics about the education. And that was, now we are again trying to change the we are looking how to develop planning and things like that. Sorry, I have to leave because I have a problem right there.
Okay,
But maybe I can write something and send it to you if you give me to explain what I was trying to say.
yes,
You're
and
nice to meet you. Yvonne, nice to meet you.
nice to
Thank you
meet
very
you.
much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hang on. All right, John. Well, this is sort of all I had, just sort of, if you come back with the board that you're working with,
Mhm.
to do it, you'll do that impact assessment. And, if it's been a few years, it'll be interesting to see what issues were addressed and what, remain, challenging. But maybe, more clarity, because that's what we're seeing with repeated use. We covered that last time. So the value of performance assessment isn't in one-time assessments, it's over time.
Yep.
And we see both board directors, boards, and organizations becoming significantly more effective with each assessment. And so that tells you that you can't just, developing that confidence is going to take time.
Right.
And learning will happen within the process. You can't dump knowledge into people. It's experiential and they'll learn through it.
Yeah.
And the next time they engage, they'll learn maybe different things. And they will develop as leaders in this area. So, which I have actually, having been through it and reviewing that data and really being challenged to see, can we really implement in practice? Can we put theory into practice? And my answer is yes,
Mhm.
but it does take time. And I think taking on the issues and knowing that this is a continual improvement process, that's what's incremental, not the plan, for example, right?
Yeah.
Development of the board is incremental and needs to be part of that process. So anyways, I forgot to plug my computer in, so I'm getting a low battery
Uh-oh.
sign, but really great to see you. And maybe we can catch up sometime soon.